Welcome to my channel, Brain in a Vat. My name is Andrew Knight. I have a letter. Dear Brain in a Vat, I'm hearing a lot in the news about the federal debt ceiling, the rising federal debt, and calls for a balanced budget. Just like my own household, we need to balance the budget, right? Even better, we need to actually pay down the federal debt, or else our children and grandchildren will be saddled by this debt burden, right? P.S. If you tell me I'm wrong, I will regard you as clinically insane. Unfortunately, you're wrong. The federal debt does not ever have to be paid back. But not only does it not have to be, it actually cannot mathematically ever be paid back. In this talk, I'm going to explain why that's true by explaining where money comes from and kind of figuring out some of the logical implications of that. So the first question is, where does money come from? And to address that, I want to point out a contradiction. A lot of people have noticed it, but they kind of set it to the side and don't think about it too much because it's two statements that are in blatant disregard of each other, and it's very confusing. So the first statement is this. Something that we're told is that the U.S. government has the ability and willingness to print essentially unlimited dollars. Right? That's the first statement. We hear it from political and economic pundits all the time, right? The U.S. government is running its printing presses and causing inflation, right? That's the claim that that's where inflation comes from because the U.S. government is constantly printing new money. So that's the first statement. The second statement is this. The U.S. government has debt. And in here, I'm just going to insert dollar debt. And then you can also say, sort of as a corollary of this second statement, the U.S. government has to keep borrowing money in order to fund the military and welfare and federal highways and everything that it spends money on. So if you think about these two statements, right, these are kind of what seem to be indisputable statements about the state of the U.S. economy. The problem is they conflict. They don't make any sense together. It doesn't make any sense for a government to have debt in dollars and the ability and the willingness to print the dollars that it needs, right? If you have personal debt and you could legally print US dollars, then why would you ever have debt? If you did have debt, you would certainly pay it off, but more importantly, why would you ever have debt to begin with if you actually have access to those printing presses of the US dollars? So if you just stare at this for a while, you may have already known in the back of your mind this contradiction whenever you read the Wall Street Journal or whatever it is you're reading. But you may not have just seen it this clearly and thought about it this clearly. The fact is, these are in contradiction. They conflict with each other because the U.S. government would not have debt in U.S. dollars if it actually had the ability and willingness to print unlimited dollars. So that must mean that one or both of these statements is wrong. Well, which one is wrong? Well, we know number two is in fact correct. So what this tells us is that the first statement is wrong. Now, what's wrong with that statement? If you go to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in DC, where the printing presses actually exist that print the dollars, Isn't that a federal government building? Yes. The printing presses themselves, don't they belong to the Treasury Department of the federal government? Yes. But in fact, the dollars that are printed on those presses do not belong to the US government. I know that sounds really, really counterintuitive, and I'll explain further in this video how that can be true and what is actually the source of the money. So, one is wrong. So it turns out it's not the US government that has the ability and willingness to print unlimited dollars, but rather it is the Federal Reserve which has the ability and willingness to print, and I'll take away the word unlimited dollars, because one of the stated goals of the Federal Reserve is monetary policy and controlling the value of the US dollar, so it can't just print unlimited dollars. And the Federal Reserve itself is sort of a quasi-government organization. It has a .gov website. So the Federal Reserve is essentially the bank for banks. So I can't go and open an account at the Federal Reserve, but the bank that I do business with does in fact have an account at the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve isn't actually owned or controlled directly by the United States government. Now there's some control. Congress can, in principle, require it to do things and legislate over it, but it just doesn't do that. So for the most part, the Federal Reserve is an independent organization, and its independence helps to keep politics separate from monetary policy. That's the good side. So in any event, the point I'm trying to make is that it is the Federal Reserve that actually has the ability to print these dollars. So how does it actually happen? That's what I want to explain right now. So to explain how money gets into circulation, let me briefly talk about fractional reserve banking. It's not difficult. The idea is simply this. Let's just say that there are $100 in your pocket that you want to invest or you want to deposit into a bank. So here's what you do. You take it to your local bank, and the bank accepts it as a deposit. Now, that bank, now this is a $100 bill. It's called high-powered money. So you deposit that in a bank. The bank is required by law to keep a certain fraction of its liabilities in cash. When you say liabilities, what's the liability? Well, the liability is, once I deposit $100 into the bank owes me $100. And the way it tells me that is it gives me a bank statement that says I have $100 in my account. But there actually aren't $100 in the account. And I'll explain why and what happens to that. But the point is, the bank then owes me $100, so it becomes a liability of the bank. So the bank is required to keep a certain fraction of its liabilities in reserve. Now, the reserve can be cold hard cash. It can be bank accounts at the Federal Reserve, but it has to be what's called high-powered money. And that fraction depends on a lot of things, and it's changed over the years, but more or less, it's a good rule of thumb is it's about a tenth, or about 10%. So what that means is that the bank only has to keep 10 of my dollars in cash or money at the Federal Reserve Bank, and with the remaining $90, it can then lend it out. So if it lends out now $90 to someone else, well, that person maybe can spend it and do stuff with it, but then eventually it ends up at another bank. Now let's just say it happens to be at this original bank. So now the bank can take that $90, only has to keep $9 in the bank, plus the original 10, and now can lend out another $81. And so the bank can keep doing this over and over and over, and if you do the numbers, it's actually relatively simple math to do. I'm not going to do it right now. But for a 10% reserve ratio, what that means is that the bank is actually able to produce an additional $900 in loans that it loans to other people. So there's essentially a creation of $900. It's called checkbook money. It's liabilities of banks. That money gets into circulation. So what that means is that so there's $900 of liabilities by the bank, and then another $100 to me, but the bank only has the $100 in cash. So the bank only has my $10 and only has $90 of this liability. And this is what caused runs on banks in the, 1800s, early 1900s, and certainly the most famous ones were during the Great Depression. People would run to the bank and ask for their money back, but the bank doesn't have it. The bank only has a small fraction of that money in cash. The rest of the money just doesn't exist. I mean, it's liabilities of the bank. Now, there were all kinds of laws put into place to kind of prevent these sorts of runs on banks. But the point that I wanted to make was that this $100 bill, which was the cold hard cash that I have, actually turns into something like $1,000 spendable in an economy. So the question I want to answer right now is, where does the cash, the high-powered money, actually come from? Let's say that the US government wants $1,000. Now, these numbers are ridiculously low. In reality, the US government spends insane quantities of money, but we'll just use small amounts for right now. So let's say that the US government wants to raise $1,000. So what it does not just go to the printing presses and print $1,000 and spend that money. That is not what happens, I promise you. What actually happens is they issue debt in the form of T-bills, T-bonds, treasury bills. The idea is that it's just pieces of paper that they sell that say, look, we're going to then redeem that piece of paper for more money in the future, i.e. with interest. So let's say that the federal government wants $1,000. It will issue, say, a $1,000 T-bill or just some debt certificate. And it'll sell that to somebody with $1,000. Well, in an economy that has no cash, well, you just can't, the $1,000 don't exist. So what actually happens is this. On average, the Federal Reserve purchases government debt at a rate that approximates the quantity of high-powered money in the economy. I think it's called M0 or M1. So let's say the Federal Reserve purchases $100 of this, and the federal government, so let's say instead of one $1,000 debt certificate, the federal government actually has 10 $100 savings bonds or whatever it happens to be. Well, the Federal Reserve will purchase one of those, and then the remaining 9 of these will just be purchased by other people. Well, I know we don't even have any money in this economy yet. Forget about that for a second. The point is the Federal Reserve will purchase that first one. How does the Federal Reserve pay for that? Well, here's what they do. They say, here is a check for $100 payable at the Federal Reserve. Can I please have this debt certificate now? And that's what happens. And it's just a ledger entry stating that the Federal Reserve has created $100 in the form of a check payable to the Federal Reserve to purchase this debt certificate from the federal government. Federal government now, they don't have any cash. They have a $100 IOU from the Federal Reserve. What do they do with that? Well, that IOU from the Federal Reserve is the same. It's treated the same as high-powered money, which is the same as cash. So now that $100 check, whenever the US government deposits that check into a commercial bank, which it does, that $100 can then be re-lent out many times, smaller and smaller portions, until eventually that $100 turns into a $1,000 liability of that commercial bank. So it's as if now that $100 in high-powered money has turned into $1,000. Now all of that money lent out by that bank, it goes somewhere, and let's say eventually that money comes back and those people want to invest it in government debt obligations, and that's what they do. So that's where the additional $900 comes to purchase that government debt. So what I'm saying is, on average, whenever the government issues debt or takes on, has to borrow money, on the order of, about 10% of that gets purchased in the form of high-powered money by the Federal Reserve, and the remaining amount gets purchased by investors who got their money ultimately through commercial banks, which had lent out that original high-powered money. This sounds a little wacky, doesn't it? It does sound wacky. Notice I haven't even said anything about cash. Everything I've said is just about little accounting. There was a little computer entry at the Federal Reserve, and there were some computer entries at banks, and there were computer entries at the federal government. But so far, where the heck does the cash come from? Well, here's where it comes from. Ultimately, this $100 IOU from the Federal Reserve, I'm sorry, this was the IOU from the federal government that was purchased by the Federal Reserve. It purchased it with a check on the Federal Reserve. So ultimately, whenever all that money gets multiplied, which is the money multiplier, which is the inverse of the reserve ratio. So now that $100 has turned into $1,000 in the system as a whole, in the form of liabilities by commercial banks. What that means is banks, commercial banks, now owe to their depositors $1,000. Once again, that $1,000 doesn't exist. $100 exists, but only in the form of what's owed by the Federal Reserve. But in any event, the $1,000 represents liabilities to the depositors to those various banks. So what happens if a depositor comes in and says, all right, I would like to withdraw $1, and I need it in cash? What happens? There's no cash in the system, right? Well, essentially what happens is the commercial bank, if that cash didn't exist, would ultimately ask for $1 cash from the Federal Reserve, which again, if cash doesn't exist, the Federal Reserve then sends an order to the Treasury Department of the US government, which is different from the Federal Reserve. It sends an order, the Federal Reserve sends an order to the Treasury Department to fire up the printing presses at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in DC to print that $1 bill. And that $1 bill then gets shipped to the bank, the commercial bank, and then ultimately to the depositor who wants that $1 to spend. So it's a very strange system. It has benefits and detriments. But one thing that is important to note is that let's look at where all this money came from. Remember, at first there was no money at all. The federal government doesn't have any money. It wants $1,000. So what it does is it offers $1,000 in debt certificates to sell them, so that eventually the investors will get their interest. Where does the interest come from? I'll get to that. So the federal government sells these debt certificates. A certain portion of them are purchased by the Federal Reserve, where the Federal Reserve just writes a check, which is itself an IOU for, say, $100. So then that $100 gets, distributed throughout, the populace, and ultimately it ends up in commercial banks. Most of it ends up in commercial banks, where the money multiplier allows that $100 to turn into $1,000. But again, this $1,000 in commercial banks are liabilities to the depositors. They're owed to the depositors. But before it got to that point, how did the $100 multiply into the $1,000? Well, $100 was, or $90 was lent out, and then of that $90 that came back to the bank, $81 was lent out, and of that $81 that came back to the bank, 70-some dollars are lent out. It's all about lending it out, all of it. So notice that this $100 was lent to the federal government by the Federal Reserve, and then the remaining $900, which are liabilities by the commercial banks, came into existence by this $100 being lent out to businesses and consumers. So what that means is that every single dollar, every dollar of this $1,000 came into existence by borrowing. I'll say it again. Every single dollar of the high-powered money and the low-powered money, the checkbook money, every one of those dollars came into existence by somebody or some business or some government borrowing that dollar. So I'm just going to pull out a dollar bill from my wallet. This dollar, this exact dollar, was borrowed, not by me, I didn't borrow it, but it was borrowed by somebody, whether it was ultimately borrowed by the federal government that spent it, or borrowed by a up-and-coming business that had to borrow money and then spent it on its employees, or maybe it was borrowed by consumers who were spending more than they have and so they had to borrow it. The point is, this dollar and every other dollar in existence came into being by being borrowed by someone. That's weird, but it's also complicated and mathematically troublesome because the person who borrowed this dollar originally, I don't know who it was. I mean, I don't know how long this dollar has been in circulation. But the very first person or entity to have that dollar had to have borrowed it. And I don't know who that is. But somewhere there is some organization or government or business or person who owes this particular dollar back to a commercial bank, or if it came from the government, the federal government, it owes it back to the Federal Reserve. Every dollar every dollar that exists came into existence through borrowing. Now, it's very strange. That has given rise to lots of conspiracy theories about the Federal Reserve. I'm sure you can read about them. That isn't what this is about. In fact, there are probably very good reasons for the system that we have set up. And the strongest one that I can point out to you is because it is not the federal government that prints dollars. It has to borrow dollars. That means it has to be fiscally conservative, at least to some degree, in order to carry on. It can't just, if it actually did have controls, right, in the very beginning of the video I explained, if it did have control over the printing presses and this willingness to just print as much as it wanted, then no, there would be no federal debt, but inflation would be absolutely through the roof. And we couldn't rely on the US dollar as a store of value, as a medium of exchange, all the different requirements of a currency. So in fact, the independence of the Federal Reserve Bank allows this kind of separate control of monetary policy outside the hands of popular politicians that maybe just want to keep inflating the money supply and ultimately causing high inflation. This is all true. I know this seems absolutely wild, but it's all true. So now I want to get to the question of, should we pay off the federal debt? Should we try to pay it off? Should we even, over the long run, have a balanced budget? And the answer is no, no, no. It is possible in the short run to have a balanced budget, but it's a really, really bad idea. But in the long run, you cannot, over the long run, pay down the federal debt. It's impossible because every dollar that exists ultimately came from debt. So what that means is the federal government debt is on the order of, I think right now, because of the debt ceiling issue, it's on the order of something like $30 trillion. Now, trillion means there's 12 zeros behind it. It's a very, very big number. Well, how about this? We'll just pay off the debt tomorrow. Everyone just open your wallets and everyone just send in all your cash to the federal government. We'll be done. We'll pay it off, right? No, absolutely not. All of the money that exists is the result of debt. So you might ask, well, how much money actually exists in circulation? The Federal Reserve stopped publishing M3 a while ago, and I haven't even looked at M0 or M1 in quite some time. I think M0 is the amount of cold hard cash in circulation, and then M1 includes checkbook money and some other things, some other liabilities. But the point is, you can ask the question, how much money exists in the US economy? And I don't mean the value of homes, because the value doesn't mean anything except in relation to the currency that you're using to value it. So the question is, if everyone right now emptied their pockets, cleaned out their bank accounts, sent it to the federal government, how much of the federal debt would we be able to pay off? And the answer is something like 10%-ish. Might be 5%, might be 15%, but it's on the order of 10%. There's about $3 trillion in existence. So if we spent everything we had, we wouldn't even make a dent in the federal debt. But then it'd be far worse, because we wouldn't have any cash to buy things, and the economy would absolutely collapse. So it is an absolute mathematical impossibility to pay off the federal debt. But more importantly, because money equals debt, because of that, we need more debt over time to allow for a growing economy. And the reason is this. I'm going to take a sidestep right here and talk about inflation. So inflation is when prices rise generally. Now, there could be inflation in the housing market, could be inflation in electronics, could be inflation in certain areas, but in general, inflation just means generally rising prices. Now, here's the thing. Humans are productive. We're a productive country. We're a productive people. So we produce new things in the form of consumer products, in the form of houses, in the form of cars, in the form of services. Those are new. So we need, as we are more productive over time, we need new money to be able to purchase that growth in the economy. So inflation is not the same thing as printing money. It's not the same thing. Now, printing money is a necessary condition for inflation. You have to be printing money. But printing money alone does not cause inflation, because if you're printing money at just the right rate, i.e. at the rate of general productivity of the country, then there's basically going to be no inflation. If you print it way faster, you will get inflation. If you don't print money at all, or if you even print it too slowly, you will get deflation, which is a dropping in prices, which is generally far worse than inflation for reasons I'm not going to go into right now. So, in other words, what this means is that to maintain price stability in a productive country, you have to print money. You have to. to be able to pay for those new goods and services. You just have to get that number right. You just have to make sure you're printing at the right rate. And that's one of the services that the Federal Reserve provides, is trying to figure out more or less how much money needs to be injected into the US economy in order to maintain price stability, or I think their targeted 2% rate of annual inflation. So you have to print money. But remember, all money is debt. So if we already have, say, 30 trillion in federal debt, but as a productive nation, let's say we've produced, 3%-ish, something like that. So let's say that we have produced another $1 trillion worth of value in the economy. Well, that $1 trillion has to exist, has to be put into the economy. At least $1 trillion in this case. So what I'm arguing is that the situation of 1 trillion in general productivity. That means that the Federal Reserve is going to have to inject at least an overall $1 trillion into the economy to make up for and purchase that productivity to maintain price stability. But on top of that, this $30 trillion is owed, the federal government owes it to whoever holds its bonds. And not only does it owe that, but it owes future interest too, right? The people are not purchasing these bonds for free. They want a return on their money. So next year, this $30 trillion maybe would automatically turn into, say, $31 or $32 trillion, depending on the interest rate. So in other words, the new money that has to be injected into the economy in the form of debt, because that's the only way that new money exists, that new money has to provide for purchasing that new productivity and the interest on the existing debt. So that means that not only can we not keep the 30 trillion debt and just keep it like that balanced forever, that's the reason you can't have a balanced budget, but say another trillion, and plus for interest payments another 2 trillion needs to be injected into the economy to be able to make up for this. So really, this time next year, we're going to have to be at 33 trillion or something. But the point is, it has to keep going up, and it has to go up at an exponential rate, because that's how compounded interest works. So not only does the federal government debt have to go up to keep up with the interest that it owes, but on top of that, it has to be able to inject new money into the economy to make up for the productivity of its citizens. And so it just means that on average, we could maybe have a year or two of a balanced budget, but it would be disastrous. But you could not have a balanced budget for much longer than that, and you certainly cannot on net pay off the federal debt. We need federal debt in order to provide the money to buy the goods and services and pay for the interest on the existing system and on our productivity. We have to have it. What about the argument that we're leaving this debt to our children? Well, here's the thing. The federal government, I'm going to say something, you're not going to believe me. The federal government, on average, never pays a single dollar in interest, ever. I should say it never pays a single dollar in interest on net. Because what it actually does, what the federal government does, when it owes $1 of interest, it issues $1 or more in a new debt certificate. That's right. So on net, in the existing system, in which the Federal Reserve is the one that controls monetary policy, which has existed since 1913. In this existing system, the federal government never has and never will pay a single dollar in interest. All it does is roll over that interest in the future. So whenever, if the federal government, say, owes $1 trillion in interest and wants to spend $1 trillion on services, what it does is it issues $2 trillion in debt so that $1 trillion of that pays the investors, and then $1 trillion is spent on other goods and services. So really, it's just the new investors lining up at the discount window to purchase debt that pays for the retirement of old debt, which is, in fact, the world's largest Ponzi scheme. That's right. Now, I'm having some fun with this here. Is it a Ponzi scheme? Mathematically, yes. Is it something we should be worried about? No, because a Ponzi scheme must always grow. It must continue to grow, and the idea is that the old investors get paid by new investment, and that is true of the federal government. The difference is that in the case of the U.S. economy, there will always be a guaranteed buyer of new government debt, and that is the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, as part of its mandate, is to keep purchasing and upholding the value of U.S. government debt. And so in doing so, yeah, mathematically it is a Ponzi scheme, but it doesn't make any difference because there will always be new money because the Federal Reserve can and does purchase as many assets as it needs to in order to inject the required money or liquidity into the U.S. economy. So having said that, because the federal government is always rolling over rolling over interest, and then on top of that spending more money in order to inject money into the economy, because of that, is this something that we should be worried about our children and our grandchildren repaying? And the answer is, as long as the Federal Reserve continues to do a competent job, and it may, for the foreseeable future, then no, it is not something that our children or grandchildren will ever have to pay off, for the same reason that we, on net as a nation, are not paying the interest on previous loans because new debt is being issued by the U.S. government to roll over those old loans. Now, having said all this, it does not mean that hyperinflation could not happen in the U.S. If monetary policy were terribly mishandled by the Federal Reserve, then they certainly could do some destructive things to the economy. That certainly is possible. But as long as the Federal Reserve continues to competently manage the U.S. dollar by purchasing assets at a rate that allow new money to be injected into the economy in a way that allows for price stability, as long as that remains true, we've got nothing to worry about for the U.S. economy as a whole. I mean, there could be bubbles, there could be stock market crashes and so forth, but overall, the economy would be sound as long as the Federal Reserve is able to and continues to purchase assets at an appropriate rate. The problem is that if Congress does not allow new debt to be issued, then eventually what happens is the Federal Reserve has to start purchasing something. It has to get money into the U.S. economy. And in the 2000s, during the financial crisis and other times, it actually did start purchasing things other than US government debt. But we don't want that. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the Federal Reserve to be owning Picassos, and to be owning expensive cars and businesses and these sorts of tangible assets. I'm not saying that has happened. I'm just saying if the federal government cannot purchase new government debt because the US government won't issue any because people are so worried about the rising federal debt and a balanced budget, etc., then it will have to resort to purchasing real assets, things, real estate. And that's not something we want. We want the Federal Reserve to be buying pieces of paper and paying for it with pieces of paper. That's how this fiat money economy works at its best. But if they're now starting to purchase, big pieces of farmland or major companies or, shares of stock in companies, then now it's really getting the tentacles into the economy a little bit too much in ways that neither the citizens nor the Federal Reserve actually want. So the federal government has to be amenable to continuing to issue new debt at a rate that allows repayment of interest on old debt and for the payment of all the goods and services provided by the federal government, because ultimately that's where a significant portion of the money comes from. So, in conclusion, we cannot mathematically ever pay off the US government debt, and we shouldn't even try, because we have to have a growing federal debt, an exponentially growing federal debt, just to maintain price stability because of the unique relationship between the Federal Reserve and the US government. The US government issues debt bonds that are purchased by the Federal Reserve with dollars printed on the presses owned by the Treasury Department. I know it's wacky, but that's how it is, and we cannot pay off or even try to pay off the federal debt. If you have other questions, my blog is Brain in a Vat, or just inavat.com, and I can be reached by email if you have other questions on physics or economics or lots of other stuff. I can be reached aknight@alum.mit.edu. Thank you for your time.